After being with Ethan for 12 years, I thought we would be the exception. Until that day, when I saw a young woman get into his passenger seat. Ethan explained that she was just a colleague on a business trip, but what kind of colleague shares a hotel room? The night Ethan and the woman stayed together in a guest house, I decisively packed my bags and left our shared home. Later, Ethan knelt and begged for my forgiveness. Chapter 1. Late at night, I suddenly received a friend request on my phone. It was from a stranger with a cute girl's profile picture, but I couldn't recall where I had seen her before. Out of curiosity, I accepted the request, but I never expected her first message to send chills down my spine. "Sis, are you there? Sorry to bother you so late, but I think you'd be very interested in some photos I have." She then sent 6 consecutive pictures, showing a man in various poses around a house. The girl continued, "I don't know what you think, but I believe if a man doesn't love you anymore, the right thing to do is to leave voluntarily. Don't cling on pathetically. Oh, sis, I didn't mean to upset you, just hoping you'd understand sooner. Goodbye." Her words were sly and disgusting. But before I could reply, a red exclamation mark appeared on the screen. Wow, she was quick to block me, knowing she'd get cursed out. But her messages were clearly true. After seeing each photo clearly, I decisively packed my things and rushed back home overnight. I couldn't be mistaken, the man in the photos was indeed my boyfriend on a business trip. After 12 years together, I knew every move he made. Though my heart ached, my mind was exceptionally clear. Chapter 2. Ethan had been genuinely good to me for these 12 years. But his change of heart was also real. In fact, I had noticed some signs a month ago to 00 calls in his call log in a month. And the girl he picked up several times on his way home from work. This message just made me see the man clearly. In those moments I didn't know about, Ethan had already formed countless connections with someone else. Fortunately, before I got together with Ethan, my dear parents had made a pact with me. To this day, Ethan doesn't know my true identity. After leaving that $1,000 rental apartment, I drove straight back to the luxurious villa in the city center, the Bright family home. The butler at the gate woke up from his nap and hurried to greet me. At that moment, I was very grateful Ethan didn't know about my family background and even more thankful for my parents' foresight. In the years with Ethan, I squeezed into a small rental apartment with him, occasionally facing sudden evictions from the landlord. Although my parents didn't oppose my relationship with Ethan, they cut off all my bank cards. They said they would only accept Ethan into the family if we could endure and make it through together. So, I endured a lot of hardships with Ethan over the years. But we were in love, and I naively believed love could conquer all. But now, reality had slapped me hard in the face, and no matter how much I tried to find excuses for him, I couldn't defend him. I was curious though, why Ethan, who was always so honest and proper, would do something like this. Because it was completely out of character for him. Chapter 3. The first day I returned home, my parents had mixed expressions on their faces. Mostly, they were pleasantly surprised. After all, in order to be with Ethan, I rarely called, let alone visited home. Father, silent as always, just nodded and gestured for me to sit. Mother, on the other hand, noticed the emotions in my eyes. After a moment of hesitation, she asked, "Sweetie, did you have a falling out with that boy?" Sweetie was my parents' affectionate nickname for me since childhood. But my full name is Autumn Bright. As the only child in the family, my parents, who run a large company, never tried for a second child despite me being a girl. Growing up in a happy family, I never imagined I'd become a rebellious child after meeting Ethan. Thinking about the man I had been with for 12 years, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. Ethan didn't even know I had left. I looked up at my parents and quickly made a decision. "Dad, Mom, I want to return to the company." I had made up my mind. Regarding Ethan's betrayal, I wanted revenge, but I also wanted my career. I wanted to return to the family company to hone my skills and make my parents proud. But I didn't want to tell my parents about Ethan's betrayal, simply saying we had irreconcilable differences. Fortunately, they didn't press for details. During my time at home, I blocked Ethan's contact. I indulged in the long-missed luxuries of the large hot springs and swimming pool, ran freely and painted in the flower-filled garden. I indulged in the hobbies I had given up for 12 years to save money. The next time I received a call from Ethan was a week later. Feeling a sudden urge to see what he was up to, I unblocked his number just as his call came through. His voice was as usual, calm and indifferent. "Autumn, it's raining outside. Remember to pick me up at the airport later. I'll arrive at 9. Raining? I looked out the window and indeed, raindrops were starting to fall, leaving streaks on the glass. But expecting me to pick him up. No way. Judging by Ethan's tone, he probably hadn't realized I had silently broken up with him. After all, he never initiated contact unless I did. Thinking about how I had moved out overnight while he was probably having a good time with another girl, I felt a wave of nausea. The feeling of disgust towards Ethan had never been so strong. Watching the rain intensify outside, I thought of something more interesting than a direct refusal. With a smirk, I said, "Sure, wait for me there. I'll be right over." I must say, Ethan had achieved nothing in these years. After graduation, he kept talking about saving money, but he couldn't even afford a car. If it weren't for me driving the family's housekeeper's car, we would have been riding a scooter in the rain all these years. Thinking about how I used to drop everything to pick him up whenever he called, I felt foolish. Ethan seemed pleased, trying to say something. "Okay, But I hung up the phone a second before he could speak, putting him back on the block list. What a nuisance. Why did I unblock him in the first place? Ridiculous. The rain continued outside, and as the clock approached 9, I took a hot bath, changed into my pajamas, and comfortably lay back in bed. Chapter 4. I kept my phone off all night. I didn't care how he got home. I had a very restful sleep. While eating the breakfast prepared by the housekeeper in the living room, I turned on my phone. Let's see how that loser is doing. Almost instantly, my message list flooded with over a dozen missed calls, all from Ethan, from 9 o'clock until 3:30 in the morning. It was clear he had given up calling after failing to reach me. I was very satisfied with this. He never called me more than 3 times because I always answered. Seeing the clear sky outside, I opened his chat window and thought for a moment. Yes, it was time to end this. I took screenshots of the messages the girl had sent me and sent them to Ethan, adding a few newly learned phrases. "Ethan, before receiving her messages, I always thought our relationship was pure. That girl told me a lot. If you want to know more, you can ask her directly, though she might not tell you the truth. Just like between you and me, and, oh, never mind." After sending the messages, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, feeling much lighter. Indeed, shifting the burden was very effective. As for what I said, it was just to disgust him. If I couldn't be happy, neither could Ethan. Who doesn't know how to sow discord? Given Ethan's suspicious nature, he probably wouldn't sleep well for several nights after seeing these messages. The thought made me feel great. I still remember that day. Seeing those 200 calls in his call log. I recalled the moments when Ethan was with me, yet managed to find time to contact another woman. In that minute, our 12 years together felt like a joke. After that, Ethan didn't contact me again, nor did he reply to any of my messages. The following week, I saw Ethan again. He would never have guessed I'd show up at the company because the company that had hired him against the odds was my family's business. I specifically chose this time to return, for no other reason. Simply to disgust and get back at Ethan. Did he think he could have a smooth ride in my family's company after offending me? Ridiculous. I'm not a saint. If someone wrongs me, I'll repay them 100-fold. I wouldn't be Autumn Bright if I didn't make him pay. Especially since he was the kind of scumbag I despised the most. Despite once loving him, he was now trash in my eyes. When I walked into the company with HR and Mr. Johnson, Ethan looked at me as if he had seen a ghost. After all, in his eyes, I couldn't possibly have the capability to join this company. HR, noticing everyone's puzzled looks, began to introduce me. "Everyone, please pause your work for a moment. I'd like to introduce our new colleague. This is Miss Bright, transferred from the headquarters as our new vice president. Miss Bright is an outstanding talent at the headquarters, and we're fortunate to have her here. Everyone should learn from her. And next to her is Mr. Johnson, the CEO of the neighboring company, here to inspect our projects." Amidst the enthusiastic applause, I looked at Ethan, whose face had turned even more ashen. I had directly jumped over his head upon my arrival. But I wasn't satisfied with just that. I glanced around and finally locked eyes with Mr. Johnson, giving him a flirtatious look. Not bad, a handsome guy. Originally, I just wanted to disgust Ethan, but the next second, a pair of large hands suddenly grabbed my wrist. I looked up to meet Mr. Johnson's playful gaze, though the smile didn't reach his eyes, just like when we were kids. Chapter 5. I was a bit taken aback. But now, like a duck being driven onto the stage, I had no choice but to go along. So, I quickly made up my mind, met his fox-like gaze, and then slightly curled my lips, throwing him what I thought was a charming wink. The scene finally ended with everyone looking incredulous. At the same time, I didn't forget to give Ethan a provocative look. Meaning, you can find someone young and so can I. After being together for over a decade, we both knew where to hit to hurt the most. So, Ethan, unwilling to be outdone, started showing off with young women in front of me. But he didn't realize that on that night, I had already made up my mind that men would only distract me from making money, so his tactics were useless against me. After several failed attempts, he couldn't bear it anymore. "Mr. Johnson, I want to report that Autumn Bright is abusing her connections. I know her abilities well, and she's definitely not qualified for this position. I request a thorough investigation from headquarters into Autumn Bright's personal connections. She must have gotten in through improper means." Ethan spoke with righteous indignation. But he didn't realize that the person sitting in front of him was none other than my uncle. The Bright family's business empire had all its high-level positions filled by our direct and extended family members. My uncle, looking somewhat shocked, glanced at me. After receiving my signal, he cleared his throat and put on a serious face. "Well, Ethan, what you're suggesting, I must disagree with. Our headquarters recruitment process is extremely rigorous." "Are you, Ethan, questioning the headquarters?" I crossed my arms and watched him with amusement. "Let's see what else you can come up with." Caught off guard and unable to achieve his goal, Ethan almost got labeled as questioning his superiors. Standing there, veins bulging on his forehead, he finally lowered his head reluctantly. "No, Mr. Johnson, that's not what I meant." My uncle waved his hand dismissively, starting to shoo him away. "Since you understand, go back to your work. Focus on your duties, that's what's important. Stop thinking about irrelevant things and spreading rumors about your superiors." Leaving the office, Ethan shot me several resentful glances. But what I didn't expect was that a girl would come to me, uninvited. She stood in front of my desk, looking down at me disdainfully. "You're the one behind this, aren't you? Don't think you're all that just because you have some looks. In this world, it's not about sleeping your way to the top. I advise you to apologize to Ethan." I looked up, puzzled. "Who are you?" I didn't recall any big shots in this company that I didn't know, given the family connections, but her face did seem somewhat familiar. Seeing me talk back, her face grew angrier. "What did you say? How dare you call me big sister? Do you know who my father is?" I replied. "Who? Is he going to take my life or something? I'm so scared." Her anger deepened. "You're asking for it." At that moment, a commanding voice interrupted. "He's my father." Chapter 6. The middle-aged man who entered looked very displeased. He unceremoniously sat across from my desk, disdainfully scanning my office and wrinkling his nose in disgust. Then he assumed an authoritative posture. "I've heard about the talent transferred from the headquarters, and today I finally meet you. You're Autumn, right? You might not know me, but that's not important. What's important is that your actions today have upset my daughter. Young people should learn to bow their heads. How about this? Sweetie, tell her what should be done." With the middle-aged man's support, the girl became even more arrogant, raising her chin high. "Well, Dad, let's have her apologize to me and Ethan outside, and then publicly swear never to upset me again." She then affectionately took the middle-aged man's arm. "Dad, what do you think?" Watching the loving father-daughter act unfold before me. Given the middle-aged man's demeanor and arrogance, I quickly figured out who he was. Looking at the two of them, I raised an eyebrow. "Huh, quite the tone. Old man, you're not an employee here, are you? Let me guess. A board member?" The middle-aged man seemed surprised that I had guessed his identity and dared to be so disrespectful. He immediately got angry, slamming the table and standing up. "You ungrateful brat. Do you believe I can have you out of this company tomorrow?" Seeing him lose his temper, I felt even more delighted, crossing my arms and leaning back. "Oh, I'm curious how a board member can interfere with company decisions. Old man, you're quite amusing." Ridiculous, a mere shareholder acting so high and mighty. But what I didn't expect was that my words seemed to hit a nerve. He threw off the girl clinging to his arm and looked like he was about to come at me. Fortunately, I was quick. Before he could reach me, I grabbed a cup of freshly poured hot water from the table and splashed it forward. Splash! It wasn't scalding, so it wouldn't cause injury, but it was humiliating. The steaming water drenched him, and even the girl standing nearby wasn't spared. At this moment, a voice broke the tension. Mr. Johnson looked at me incredulously. "Water festival." Mr. Johnson's sudden arrival made the middle-aged man freeze. As the CEO of the neighboring company, Mr. Johnson was known for his ruthless and cunning methods in the industry. Although the middle-aged man was a shareholder, he didn't dare to act out in front of Mr. Johnson. For a moment, he stood there, seething with anger, glaring at me as if he could shoot fire from his eyes. I placed the cup back on the table and forced a laugh. "Mr. Johnson, you're quite the joker. Can't you see I'm teaching someone a lesson?" Mr. Johnson, hands in his pockets, looked like he was enjoying the show. But what I didn't expect was his next words. "Mr. Brown, your boss specifically asked me to tell you not to harass the employees. New rule: board members are not to interfere with company management." New rule? Who made that rule? I looked at the man in front of me, who seemed serious but whose words were always so hard to read. Chapter 7. With Mr. Johnson's intervention, the middle-aged man had no choice but to leave, fuming. Watching their retreating figures, I finally remembered. If the girl's father's last name was Brown, she must be Emily Brown, the girl who had recently tried to steal Ethan from me. I didn't expect to meet her so soon and under such unpleasant circumstances. But it was satisfying. And she didn't seem like a good person, clearly used to bullying others. Who knows how many people in the company she had tormented? Since that's the case, don't blame me for being unkind. I'll deal with both the scumbag and the mean girl together. I originally thought Mr. Johnson would say something or had some business, but he just looked around and then left with his hands in his pockets. I couldn't help but twitch my mouth. Weird. He's always been like this, arrogant since we were kids. After this incident, Ethan seemed to have a different view of me. After several attempts to pass by my office, he finally couldn't resist coming in. Rubbing his hands. Autumn?" Hearing the familiar voice above my head, I looked up. Seeing it was Ethan, I couldn't help but roll my eyes. "What's up, Mr. Ethan?" No. He kept rubbing his hands, his eyes slyly scanning my office. I just thought about it and realized I was really a jerk. I wanted to apologize. I waved my hand, showing no expression. But Ethan seemed to think I meant I wasn't going to pursue it, and his eyes brightened. His tone became increasingly strange. "Autumn, how did you suddenly decide to join this company? Was there some special reason?" Hearing his obvious probing, I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. Impatiently, I said, "What do you think? Maybe I'm just that capable. Hey, being too excellent is also a problem." This guy, seriously? Not getting any useful information from me, Ethan reluctantly left after several days of observation. However, my altercation with the shareholder and the water incident eventually reached my parents' ears. After dinner, my father gave my mother a look. She picked up on it and chose a suitable moment to probe. "Sweetie, I heard you had an argument at the company?" I replied. Then I nodded. "Yes, I did. I even gave him a taste of the water festival." Hearing this, my parents exchanged glances. But Mr. Johnson, who was also at our house for dinner, seemed to find it amusing. He calmly said, "They're just some sycophants. Autumn handled it very well. It was quite satisfying to watch." My parents finally remembered and turned to Mr. Johnson. "Oh right, you were there that day, Mr. Johnson? How did it go? Our sweetie wasn't bullied, was she?" I quickly nodded. "No, he arrived just as the old man was about to lose his temper." My parents finally relaxed, murmuring, That's good. Mr. Johnson, you're still as protective of our sweetie as you were before." Then, remembering a significant issue, my father became serious again. "That Mr. Brown, I never liked him. Today, he dared to bully my daughter. He clearly doesn't respect me." I almost choked on my food. What does that mean? But Mr. Johnson quickly understood, and after a moment of thought, he smiled and looked up. "Uncle, I have a good idea." Chapter 8. Ethan didn't get any useful information from me. So he finally concluded that I was just lucky. But seeing me getting close to Mr. Johnson, he seemed dissatisfied and started flaunting his relationship with Emily Brown in front of me. Watching Emily's triumphant demeanor, I couldn't help but laugh. A woman who only knows how to rely on men. She was never on my list of threats. But Ethan, with his boldness and ambition, was worth keeping an eye on. Yet, this was also his weak point. Seeing the right moment, I arranged a meeting with Ethan's direct supervisor at a cafe. It was time to set the stage. The man sitting across from me seemed a bit uneasy, not because of me, but because of Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson casually placed his long legs on the coffee table. "Mr. Taylor, we need you to handle something." Since my identity wasn't public in the company, Mr. Johnson had to take the lead. After explaining our plan in detail, Mr. Johnson placed a briefcase on the table and raised an eyebrow. The man quickly understood, hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right." He didn't have much choice. Within 2 days, the man had everything arranged. Ethan managed to scrape together $300,000 to invest in a tea house. Of course, we had deliberately set up the tea house, which appeared profitable on the surface but had actually been losing money for years and was on the verge of bankruptcy. These figures were just a matter of a few words for Mr. Johnson. Seeing Ethan stepping right into the trap we had set, I couldn't help but sit up in bed and praise myself. Damn, this plan is brilliant. I heard Ethan even managed to get over $200,000 from Emily. He really brings bad luck to those around him. And Emily was still foolishly happy. That rundown tea house was worth at most $20,000, not including the cost of repairs, which would only lower its value. According to my calculations, Emily's family's liquid assets were around $300,000. With her father, Mr. Brown, under my father's care. TSK. The outcome would be even more disastrous. As for Ethan, the thought of him being saddled with debt made me smile. Now, all I had to do was wait. With this investment, Ethan's attitude towards me grew more arrogant. But I completely ignored him, focusing on my own development, working hard, learning, and gradually becoming more noticeable. Ethan, after several attempts, finally caught me. "Autumn, if you bow your head now, you might still have a chance to be the boss lady of my tea house. I think your recent changes are quite good. We're a good match." He spoke earnestly. I doubted my ears. "What did you say?" Ethan, thinking he was charming, repeated. "I said if you bow your head now." "Bow your head, my ass." I was speechless and slapped him. How did I never realize Ethan was so delusional before? It's true that people change once they have money. Ethan had completely lost his youthful charm, replaced by the stench of an old man. Ethan, stunned by my slap, reacted with anger and tried to grab me, his arm swinging. Noticing his gaze lingering on my chest with a flash of desire. Damn, I was wearing a low-cut dress today. Looking around the empty parking lot, I realized I might have been too impulsive. Chapter 9. The expected slap never landed on me. Ethan was sent flying by a punch from Mr. Johnson, landing several feet away, clutching his chest and coughing. Realizing his pathetic state, he looked up angrily. You! Seeing it was Mr. Johnson, he gritted his teeth. Reluctantly, he lowered his fist. Mr. Johnson, what's the meaning of this? Are you interested in my leftovers? Let me tell you, she's just a piece of trash I've played with for 12 years. In his mind, a woman with no background, who had been dumped by him, couldn't possibly catch the eye of these big shots. But this time, Ethan was wrong. Before he could finish, I saw a blur of movement. 3 seconds later, Ethan's painful screams echoed. Ethan was completely overpowered by Mr. Johnson's nearly 6'3" frame, unable to fight back. Mr. Johnson's punches landed on his terrified face one after another, his eyes narrowed with a cold glint. I warn you, say that again and you're finished. I have 100 ways to make you disappear without a trace. Only when Ethan could barely open his eyes did Mr. Johnson release his grip, letting him collapse helplessly to the ground. I stared in disbelief at the fierce man before me. Why? Why was he so angry? And this was a public place, wasn't it bad to hit someone here? Looking at Ethan, whose head was swollen like a pig's, lying on the ground moaning, I felt a mix of emotions. Mr. Johnson walked towards me, his hands still stained with blood, whether his own or Ethan's, I couldn't tell. From a distance, he looked like a demon from hell. I instinctively stumbled back a few steps. He stopped in front of me, chuckling. Scared? Your legs are shaking so much. I thought you were fearless. With that, he walked past me. He shoved his blood-stained hands into his pockets and glanced back at me. Aren't you leaving? Waiting to get caught? Only then did I snap out of it and hurriedly followed him. Mr. Johnson couldn't help but smirk, looking at me playfully. Don't worry, he won't die. He insulted you first, this was just a lesson. As he spoke, footsteps approached from behind. Turning back, I saw 4 men in white coats surrounding Ethan, lifting him onto a stretcher and into a private car. With the situation resolved, I found myself at the seaside with Mr. Johnson. The sea breeze gradually diluted the scent of blood around him. Staring at the distant lighthouse, Mr. Johnson suddenly turned to me. You were with that guy for so long. Then, as if realizing the inappropriateness of his question, he closed his mouth. I wasn't shy about the topic. Yeah, 12 years and he cheated. Most likely, I'll never love someone so passionately again. I can't afford to gamble. Mr. Johnson's expression remained indifferent. News of Ethan's injury spread to the company. Emily Brown was the first to kick open my office door, storming in to confront me. It was you, wasn't it? Again? Why are you like a piece of trash always clinging to Ethan? And now he's seriously injured because of you. I looked up to meet her gaze. You're mistaken. It's your precious Ethan who's been clinging to me. The whole company knows. Besides, do you have any evidence that I caused Ethan's injury? Chapter 10. I trusted Mr. Johnson's handling of the situation. Moreover, if it came down to it, Ethan was the one who provoked and tried to harm me first. The Bright family and Mr. Johnson had the means to silence him. As for Emily, I was curious to see what she would do now that Ethan was in such a state. If she insisted on causing trouble, I had 1,000 ways to make her regret it. Thinking of this, I crossed my legs with interest. Speak up, Emily. Coming here without evidence, acting all accusatory, who gave you the courage? Your dad? My father was fully prepared. Now, it was just a matter of my word to cut the problem at its root. I looked at Emily with growing amusement. If she dared to say one wrong word. Emily didn't expect me to be so arrogant. She panicked for a couple of seconds before regaining her composure. You think you can scare me with this act? I'm telling you, you better apologize to Ethan. He went to see you that night and ended up like this. Who else could it be? Hey Emph, she couldn't see the situation clearly. Still thinking of protecting that scumbag Ethan. Well, don't blame me then. I stood up and slowly walked towards Emily, who was half a head shorter than me. Leaning down to her ear, I whispered. Your parents divorced a long time ago. Your stepmother has a son, did you know? With that, I shoved the documents in my hand into hers. Emily, stunned, took them. The feeling of a seemingly perfect family suddenly falling apart must be terrible. I smirked. And here's another piece of good news. Ethan has more than just you on the side. Those 200 calls I saw were just the tip of the iceberg. Once a man starts cheating, he can't help but fall into a cycle of seeking new thrills. So how could he be content with just one person? Unfortunately, Emily seemed genuinely devoted to him. She lent him hundreds of thousands for that tea house without a second thought. Too bad she trusted the wrong person. If Emily hadn't repeatedly bullied and harassed lower-level employees in the company, I wouldn't have planned to go this far. But her constant provocations had pushed me to this point. She had only herself to blame. When Ethan recovered, the first thing he did was come to the company to confront me. He had gotten smarter, avoiding Mr. Johnson's presence. Seeing the faint scars on his face, I frowned. Ethan clearly couldn't swallow his anger. Autumn Bright. You witch. Relying on a man, what kind of skill is that? A string of vulgar insults followed, and Ethan gradually lost control. The crowd suddenly parted, and seeing who had arrived, I rushed over and clung to my mother's arm. Mom, he's cursing at me. My parents had clearly heard plenty of unpleasant words. My father's face was terrifyingly dark. The high-level executives standing nearby were shocked to see me affectionately calling them Mom and Dad, silently relieved they hadn't tried to trip me up. Seeing my parents, they all politely bowed slightly. Hello, Mr. Bright. Hello, Mrs. Bright. Ethan, though unfamiliar with the Brights, realized something was wrong when he saw the company leaders bowing so deferentially. He looked at me in panic. The next second, with a heavy thud, he dropped to his knees. The Bright family was one of the top elite families in the city. Even ordinary people knew that angering the upper class had dire consequences, let alone the business-savvy Brights. Ethan ended up kneeling in front of the company for 3 whole days. Kneeling in the rain, kneeling in the sun, until I no longer wanted to see his face. Chapter 11. After leaving the company, Ethan planned to rely on the tea house to make a comeback. But unexpectedly, the tea house started losing money inexplicably, doubling the investment loss to $600,000. Watching my account balance, I couldn't stop smiling. I could already imagine Ethan's twisted face helplessly watching the losses. And he still owed Emily over $200,000. Paying it all back would be nearly impossible. Emily didn't fare much better. Her father, Mr. Brown, was kicked out of the board by my father, and his shares were reclaimed. I hadn't expected my father to have so much evidence of Mr. Brown embezzling company funds over the years. But I knew it was mostly because of me. In the end, Mr. Brown had to sell off all his assets to pay his debts, leaving his family nearly destitute, with just enough money to last half a month. At this point, their attention naturally turned to Ethan, who owed them money. How they fought it out in the end no longer concerned me. I got a visa to London and went to the city I had always dreamed of, standing in front of the clock tower, reflecting on the first half of my life. Perhaps from this moment, my life was truly beginning. Chapter 12. Mr. Johnson's perspective. The person I liked at first sight. Originally, I planned to confess to her after graduating high school, but a random guy beat me to it. That silly girl hid it well. We had promised no secrets between us. But she kept her feelings for someone else from me. I didn't attend her graduation ceremony because someone else had taken my place by her side. But I still ended up in the final group photo. Hearing her say so many hurtful things to her parents for that guy, I wondered, what charm did he have? That day, her parents fell silent looking at their phones. I knew they were heartbroken. As her childhood friend, I accompanied her parents to the amusement park we used to visit as kids. But she wasn't there. Her parents were happy, but their eyes held only regret when they looked at me. Gradually, I stopped reminiscing about the past. After my father passed away, I built our family business to rival hers. I didn't disappoint my father. But why did my heart always feel empty? I couldn't remember how long it had been since I last saw her. In the parking lot, his words were harsh. After 12 years together, that guy could say such cruel things to her. So that beating was well deserved. At the seaside, she pretended to be strong, saying she'd never love someone so passionately again. My heart ached for the first time in a long while, but it didn't matter. I was used to waiting. I just hoped that when she felt vulnerable, she would turn around and see me. My shoulder would always be there for her.